Smoke from the chimneys pressed low under a pale sky, like will tugged down over the brow of Winterfell, and the air held the taste of old iron and wood smoke and something clean, a cold that seemed to rinse the tongue. In the morning the stones breathed out a damp warmth, the way a sleeping hound exhales when you put a hand to its ribs, and beyond the outer walls the fields were rimed with fragile frost that cracked under a boothiel and glittered until the light climbed and the world's color returned. The ravens in the rookery combed their beaks on black bars and muttered to one another as Maester Luwin measured out feed, his hands stained with ink, his chain clicking in the quiet like a little wind bell. A gray bird took the offered grain and pecked the rim of the dish as if to bless it before calling once, sharp and content. It was all ordinary. That was the comfort of it. Men will make storms, Catelyn had told herself often enough. Let the stones and hearths be what they are. She stood in the covered walk that looked down upon the yard, where the first practice of the day had begun. The wooden swords made their hollow clack, 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 a sound that carried memory in it. Her boy at 6, being shown his feet by Ser Roderick. Her boy at 12 now, longer in the leg, with a seriousness in his brow that had belonged to his father at that age. The sound carried forward, too, into places she did not like to picture. The future always has a blade in it, and sometimes it is only a pruning knife and sometimes not. Robb had gray wind at his heel. The direwolf's breath smoked whitely. When it opened its jaws, the yard dogs stilled. There was no menace in the animal's posture, but posture wasn't needed. Power simply was. Everyone who'd lived in Winterfell long enough had learned to treat it as the sky is treated, present, not to be argued with. The boys from the smithy watched with that bright, injured hunger of youths who would never be lords and did not understand yet what other things they might be. Jon was there near the well, his hair black as wet elm bark, fitting a new string to his bow by feel, squinting one eye in a way that always made him look, to Catelyn, like a serious little boy again. Arya idled along the steps with her hands shoved into a pair of mittens she'd refused the evening before, because she'd been cross then and no Starks needed mittens, and now she wore them and did not mention it. She had a burr in her hair the size of a gooseberry. Sansa and the little princess stood together at the rail, their heads inclined. Sansa had braided her hair with pale blue ribbons, and the Lannister girls with white. Catelyn let her gaze rest on each child and then, as always, on the newness in that pair, that gleam of gold among her dark heads, and she felt the old discomfort lift, then settle again like a hawk test flapping its wings. Myrcella was a year older than Arya and shorter, light on her feet, easy with a curtsy and a shy smile, remembering names as if each were a secret returning to her. She had been taught well and kindly. There was a warmth in her that Catelyn could not lay at the feet of Cersei Lannister. The boy, Tommen, was a good eater. He had been amazed by the taste of hot oatcakes in the morning, spread with spiced apple and a curl of butter, and he'd said so, and then he'd asked the cook how such a thing was done. He'd watched through the whole turning of the batter, hedgehog-bristled hair standing out from the steam, cheeks pink with the heat and cold layered together, like a child watching a song rise in a singer's throat. They were wards, and that was the form of it, and good custom at that, binding blood to blood and smoothing a land until it felt like one skin worn by different bodies. That was what she had told herself when Eddard brought the matter to her 3 nights ago. His eyes quiet as a lake at dusk, holding nothing on the surface, holding everything beneath. "The king wills it," he had said, but there had been more. There had been a great deal more. Catelyn moved along the rail toward Sansa and the little princess and put a hand on the carved post that had been carved before her grandfather's father's time. Sansa did not turn to her with the urgent, proud eagerness she often had. "Mother, look." For Sansa had set herself to be polite to Myrcella while Myrcella was made to feel strange. "That is the task I set you," Catelyn thought, and it was a relief to have given it. It is good when a task can dress itself in kindness. "The snow at dawn was like sifted silk," Sansa was saying. "It is early for such snow, Luwin told me, but I like it." "I do too," said Myrcella, and there was that warm sincerity again. "It makes all the air feel white." "That is a pretty way to say it," Sansa told her, pleased without envy. She had chosen her ribbon to match Myrcella's white one, for the sake of being pleasing to the eye, and this morning it did not occur to her that white was a Lannister color also when the ground is bright with sand. She did not yet live in the world as heralds do, where everything is a sign. "My lady," Caitlin said, and Myrcella dipped a short little curtsy that would have pleased even Septa Mordain. Tommen, down in the yard, had taken a brass-studded shield and was trying not to let it pull his arm. Ser Roderick hovered in the manner of old warriors who have taught more than they have fought of late, ready to praise any small success and ready to turn failure into a step toward learning. When Tommen fell on his rump, he laughed, and lord and small folk alike laughed with him. No sting in it, that warm sincerity again, upright even in the stumble. A gust came. The girls huddled closer without thinking. Myrcella's hair caught the light and made a little fire for itself. "We will need heavier cloaks by month's end," Caitlin said. "You too, Sansa. Mordain will have the furs aired." "I like the weight of fur," Myrcella said. "It feels like being held." "Yes," Caitlin said, and felt something loosen behind the breastbone that had been tight since the conversation by the cold hearth in the solar, 3 nights ago, when Eddard had told her what he had in mind, and then what had already been done. He had gone to the king with it, of course. That part was not choice. If it had been done without Robert's leave, the name for it would not have been wardship but theft. There was a long custom for wardships, older than the Undulls, older perhaps than the first men's carvings on the heart trees. But custom is not a wall. Wind finds a crack. If Cersei Lannister wished to make of this a grievance, she would. The fear that had woken Caitlin each morning had not been of Cersei, though. It was of Tywin. She watched Tommen rise again. Jon had stepped forward, offering a hand. Tommen took it, and then, with boyish ceremony, brushed his own sleeve down as if dust mattered. That won a grin from Arya, who accepted some rights and scorned others by rules she could not yet put into words. Grey Wind's ears pricked. The big wolf looked toward the gatehouse, then away. Somewhere behind the stables, a palfrey sneezed like an old man in a chapel. The day was simple in all its noises. When Caitlin left them, she went by the inner stairs, her palms sliding along the cold stone. The solar smelled of leather and smoke and a lemon oil that she had brought from White Harbor years before when she'd missed Riverrun's breezy sweetness so badly that she'd paid a peddler more than sense would advise. The lemon had faded to a ghost, as all southern things did up here, but it lingered. The fire in the hearth ticked softly, a patient animal, well-fed and drowsy. Eddard was there, his hands flat on a map that was not really useful, old borders, ink blurred where some damp weather had found it long ago. Men liked to put the world on vellum. The world preferred breath and stone. "They laugh at him," Caitlin said gently, and he looked up. "At Tommen?" he asked, and the faintest smile touched one corner of his mouth, like a hand brushing a cheek and then withdrawn. "They will not long. He will be a strong lad if he keeps laughing when he falls. And he will fall less and less." "It is a good laughter," she said. "You chose well to invite him and his sister. He will not poison my girls with cruelty." "Children poison one another far less than we do," Eddard said. He straightened. His hair had silvered in places so quietly she had not noticed until some morning 2 winters ago when a new light had found it, and then she could not unsee it. "I did not choose Tommen. I presented the matter as a way to bind north and south. Robert chose which of his children to send north. Cersei would not have suffered Joffrey to be parted from her in any case. It is not only Cersei's suffering that would have been at stake," Caitlin said. "No," he said, and looked down at the map again as if the old ink might answer for him. "No." He told her of the crypts, of the old cold there that feast days could not sweeten, of Robert's boots ringing on the steps, and the king laughing even when he was not amused, because that was how he kept the world from laughing at him first. They had gone down in the green candlelight. They had stood in the stone company of Eddard's dead. Robert had poured a cup for Lyanna and spilled it on the floor. The king had listened, and he had roared that it was an excellent notion to take a Lannister whelp and cool him in the north until the vanity steamed off him. "We will make the boys good friends," he had said, then corrected himself with a grunt. "The children, for the girl will soften them all, won't she, Ned? By the gods. I remember how girls soften a hall." Cersei had not been in the crypts. She had been in the Queen's chambers when Eddard went to tell her, and it had gone as cold as winter steel. He spoke of it with a spareness that told Catelyn more than words. The way he had stood, the way she had opened her palm and shown nothing in it. Jaime had been there, too, all shine and smile, a cat watching the door of a mousehole, and silence like silver lying between words. Catelyn had felt the hair stir on the back of her neck at the thought of those two in one room with her husband. Dress steel as wine, she thought, and it will still cut you if you drink too much. The king's word suffices, Eddard said at last. He was looking out the narrow window toward the smoking yard and did not see her. There is custom at our back. Once my father sent Brandon to the Eyrie. Jon Arryn fed him and taught him to ride a mountain pony, and laughter returned to our house. Robert was fostered with the Wents and with the Arryns both, and some good came to him from each. And you, Catelyn said, your father sent you south, and good came of it. He looked at her then, and she could read in him, as she always could, the words that went unsaid. And ill came of it, too. Their whole life sat between those two simple truths, all the weight of joy and grief balanced like a cart on an uneven road. One will always dipped. Luwin had a raven at dawn, he said, gentle again. From King's Landing. From Lord Tywin, Eddard said, and the name was a stone dropped into her stomach. She put her hands on the table and found the grain there with her fingertips, the tiny ridges and craterings where knives had nicked it before she was born. What does he write? That he trusts the word of a king, Eddard said. He had folded the parchment back into its leather case. She knew that if she opened it she would smell a faint sharpness of something like dried apples and old vellum and a spice that would not exist up here. Something precise and foreign and controlled. And that Casterly Rock takes no offense, for none was meant. And what did he not write? That if offense had been meant, Casterly Rock has long arms, Eddard said. That is all right. We both know what is known. He does not need to break wax over it. She let out a breath then, strong enough to stir the hair at her temples. Men had a way of speaking peace while pointing to their scars. Perhaps that made them feel their scars had purpose. And Robert. The king sent a seal-broken note that says we must fatten the children or he'll have my head, Eddard said, and his mouth warmed again at one corner. His hand is twice the size of mine, did you know? The seal crushed a splinter into the board. I will have fresh honey for the girl, Catelyn said, and for the boy, oatcakes every morning until he thinks the sun rises out of the kitchen. Perhaps it does. When she left him, the day had climbed itself another rung. The practice was still going. The air now held the iron smell of sweat under the clean cold. Bran had come with Rickon on his hip, and the littlest Stark was holding a pine cone with the Wonder Men hold crowns. Myrcella had found a place beside Arya at the rail that was not too near and not too far. She had a talent for seeing spaces and measuring them in a glance. Catelyn thought of the fine, narrow passages of King's Landing she had walked years ago, too far from home to speak her fear aloud. You learned then to move like water around rocks. Myrcella looked up, saw her, and did a little not-quite curtsy of greeting, a courtesy made an instinct already. Catelyn felt the pang of it because it was attractive and because it had been taught to be attractive. She wanted someone to have told this child something once without hoping to be loved for it. She was not sure when the laughter changed timbre, warm to brightened baiting. Perhaps it was when Tommen got the stance right and overreached. Perhaps when one of the smithy lads saw a chance to look brave before a princess. But men like to test one another, and boys are men's apprentices. The blow that came was not ill-meant, not truly. It was a solid clout to the shield that Tommen failed to turn aside because he had not yet taught his body to believe the shield was part of him. He stumbled. His mouth made the small O of surprise that so often precedes tears at that age. He looked up, and in that moment Arya stopped with her hands on the rail, as if someone had told her a story she did not know the ending to. Jon took a step again, ready with the hand, and Robb called across the yard, in the voice his father had been teaching him, the one that could carry without a shout. Again, the word hung. Tommen closed his mouth. He shook out his arm and lifted the shield. A shield is a moving door. Ser Roderick barked something about knees. The boy with the practice sword looked suddenly uncertain of his part. Tommen braced, and when the next blow came, he caught it better, and though the oak bit his rim and kicked, he kept his feet. "Good," Rob called, and when Tommen glanced his way, the stark heir nodded once, exactly as Eddard would have. A cold coin paid, enough, no more. The moment softened again. Caitlin breathed. That afternoon Myrcella went with Sansa to the kitchens to learn winter manners. Though the queen had sent her with a maid and 2 men and a slantwise glance that knew how to cut without moving, Myrcella had taken to the Winterfell women as girls will who have been allowed to be girls sometimes, and the kitchens are where a house's heart reveals its pulse. She rolled dough under Gage's eye and sprinkled sugar too thick on the first tray and just right on the second. She asked Noy about the smoked salmon and did not make a face when she tasted it. She asked Hullen about the shaggy yearling in the stable who would not take the bit, and he sighed and said some horses are born to teach us patience rather than take it. She learned that old Nan's stories were true or true enough that all stories after them merely grew new coats. When old Nan said, "I knew a queen once who choked when she ate a crow," Myrcella's eyes went wide and she laughed, her hand over her mouth as if to keep the story from flying out again and being lost in the kitchen steam. Tommen discovered the kennels. He stood in the doorway first with caution, the stink and heat of the place aglow, and then his face rearranged itself into the simple holy joy small boys have for large animals. The hounds understood him at once. Dogs understand children in a direct grammar without pretense. They knew that all he wanted was to be their friend and to smell like them and to feed them things he was not supposed to feed. He sunk his hands into the ruff of a red bitch and then into another, as if he couldn't get enough of the astonishment of fur. "They're so warm," he said to no one, to everyone. When Grey Wind passed the door, Tommen held very still. The dire wolf paused and sniffed him in that grave, measuring way, then went on. Tommen let out a breath he hadn't known he'd held and then laughed again, out of the small, secret place where fear converts itself into pride. Winterfell adjusted around them the way an old cloak adjusts around a new weight in its pocket. There were extra places set at the high table with cups too easily broken for the likes of rough men. There was honey kept nearer now and a knife that belonged to a king used to cut a child's tart. There was a chair moved nearer the hearth for a quiet maid who had been a stranger yesterday and would be a friend before the new moon. The ravens had new letters to carry. Myrcella's to her mother, carefully composed by candle and checked by Luwin's patient finger. Tommen's to the king, a brave line or two in a hand that earned a smudge on his cheek. There were more linens to be warmed on copper pans at bedtime, fewer silent evenings because children will fill silence or make it warmer by sleeping in it. That night, when the hall grew loud and then soft again, Eddard went to the Godswood. The snow there did not lie evenly. It collected in small eddies and drifts around the roots, where always there was a suggestion of movement even when the air was still. The heart tree watched him as it had watched his father and the older fathers before him who had bled before it and received nothing in return but the great permission of being witnessed. Sometimes, on very quiet evenings, he found in that gaze not comfort but accuracy. It was easier to bow before a god who did not lie to you by promising to lie to others. He could hear, faintly, from very far off and very near, the muffled thud of a child's foot running down a passage, and then the hush after, tucked into sleep. He put off his gloves and set his palms to the cold bark and let the cold climb into him until it met warmth and the two found a level. He thought of Theon, sleeping in the tower. He thought of the word hostage and did not flinch from it. He thought of the ironborn father who had not come for his son in 10 years and counted that a mercy for the realm, and of the lion father who would come if he chose, and counted that more dangerous, and of the king who laughed at the danger because laughing at a thing is one way to stand upright before it. Eddard had seen the children by firelight. Myrcella's hair, even then, took light like little petals catch dew and hold it for a breath. Tommen's cheeks had a summer fruit in them. They did not look like Robert. He had noticed that in the idle way one notices that an early frost sets in a garden where the shade lies all day. It was a fact like another. Perhaps he had noticed it years ago. Perhaps he had not. The mind rearranges its furniture without asking at times. "It is nothing," he said aloud. The leaves did not answer. Men make storms, he thought, and sometimes it is right to build a wall against them, and sometimes to open the gate and let them scour the yard of old dead leaves. He prayed not in words, but in a long lack of words that was like the stillness between the drifting of 2 flakes of snow. On the road south, the king drank brown ale and cursed the slowness of the wagons and praised a well-shot goose and shot a poor one and praised it anyway. The queen rode with her back very straight. Jaime Lannister laughed when the king laughed and sometimes when he did not. At night in their pavilion, the queen wrote with a narrow pen upon cream parchment, a small neat hand that cut the page with precision. The wax she used sealed so thin that when she lifted the stick, the impression looked as if it had grown there by itself. She sent a letter to Casterly Rock. She sent one to her father's stewards in Lannisport, and one to Oldtown that had no royal business and therefore meant more. She sent one to her brother Tyrion wherever he roamed. She smiled at that one, as if to amuse herself. She sent one to a new priest in some crooked church with red glass, and then smiled again less kindly and tore it in half and burned it, watching the little blue flame bend its head and die. When she spoke to Jaime, she did so while her maid unfastened pins and let out her hair. "You will write, you will whisper, you will purr," Jaime murmured to her, and took one pin between his teeth and handed it to the maid with a flourish. "I will do nothing small," Cersei said. "The wolf has taken 2 of my cubs into his den. The king calls it custom and clasped arms with the wolf to do it. He clapped him on the shoulder like a squire. I have watched men bind themselves with gestures. Men need to be bound. And what do we need?" Jaime asked, and his eyes had that absent shine they got when he had decided the world was a fool, but he would humor it. Cersei watched the pin catch the lamplight, and her mouth made a small shape of amused wonder. "We need to be amused," she said, and obeyed. She reached for the letter she had not yet sealed. The words in it, if you turned them on their side, could be seen to be 2 letters, one before and one after. Jaime watched her write and thought, as he sometimes did against his will, of a yellow bird striking a window, mistaking glass for air. In Winterfell, a different glass stood between worlds. Arya had learned to breathe against the panes near the stair and watch her breath paint ferns. She taught Myrcella how to blow soft and draw with the side of a finger. Myrcella made a rose. Arya made what was supposed to be a dire wolf and came out looking like a duck. They laughed under their breath because of the quiet of the house at that hour, the way everything was holding itself still so that men could sleep and ride early again. Sansa hummed a tune Mordain had taught her, soft as a needle passing in and out. There was no quarrel among them that night. Even needles can lie still when the light is right. Jon kept his watch. He liked the hour when only the scullions moved softly and the breath of wolves could sometimes be heard from the courtyard like the sea in a shell. He made rounds of the towers not because he had to but because walking their spines made him feel as if the whole house carried him and he must not shame it by sloth. He paused by the door to the girls' chamber and listened a moment, then moved on. He paused by the guardroom and listened to a snore like a saw and moved on. Ghost found him in the passage like a well-thrown thought and walked beside him without sound. Jon thought of Benjen and the road north. He thought of what it would be to have the whole world behind you and a pure wind before. He had shown Tommen how to hold his bow and where his fingers belonged on the string. The boy had listened. He had that humility children have who have not yet been praised into pride. Jon wondered what it would be to be praised into pride and then to have to unlearn what you had been praised for. He wondered what it would be to be loved into folly. He did not think of himself as a philosopher. He thought of himself as a boy who liked to be where footsteps went quiet, and he was grateful to the quiet for liking him back. Old Nan told them the story of the last time a prince stayed at Winterfell. It was a foolish story, foolish because she exaggerated the height of the ice walls in it to a degree that would have had the ravens falling from the sky for fear as they flew over. Foolish because the prince in it was a hedgehog brave only in his fantasy. Foolish because she told it as if it had happened 2 winters ago and Catelyn had been there, while Catelyn knew that if she had been there, she would have told it herself. But stories need not be true to be useful. They are pockets to carry truths in. Myrcella laughed where she ought. Tommen shivered cleverly. Arya asked if the hedgehog had spines even in his dreams, and Sansa inquired after the prince's cloak. whether it were velvet or velvet lined with sable. It was wolfskin, old Nan said, and then looked at Caitlin to see whether that had been mischief, and Caitlin, who knew old Nan's thin little mischiefs and loved them, did not spoil it by a frown. Letters went back and forth. Tommen wrote to his mother about the kennels, the taste of smoked salmon, the way a wooden sword stings when your fingers are cold. Myrcella wrote about Arya making faces, about Sansa's song, about the way snow made everything white, even the inside of your thinking for a moment when you looked at it. Cersei Lannister wrote back about cloaks and about Mordain and about how the northern cold is good for roses because it kills the wrong things, which was a little like comfort and a little like threat. Robert wrote back that if Tommen could keep a bit in a winter pony's mouth, he would be king of all the pony keepers, and if not, Ned would beat him like a drum. Then crossed that out and wrote which was a jest, and then did not bother to cross out the jest again because he had already wasted the wax. Eddard read the letters with Caitlin and kept his face. Afterwards he went to the yard and stood and listened to wood on wood for a while, as if counting something only he could hear. On the third day, a messenger came with a letter that had a crabbed script and smelled faintly of rose oil and attar of some flower that had never chosen to grow north of the neck. It bore the king's own seal and someone else's words. Varys's, Caitlin guessed, all soft and careful and loyal to the king and to no one else. It advised that some murmuring had already begun in the capital, as murmuring will in a city where men live tooth to jowl and dream behind shutters. It said that names have a way of being ground together in the mortar of that city until the paste is poison or perfume. It suggested that perhaps the Lord of Winterfell might consider sending a gesture southward, a token, so that men might say, "See, we have their children and they have ours, and therefore we have each other." The letter ended with a sigh you could hear if you let your eyes rest on it long enough, and a postscript in Robert's hand that said, "Ned, damn their whispering, we did right. If Cersei had her way, the one boy would be sewn to her skirts. The girl already is," and then 3 random swear words, because sometimes that was the only way a king could feel himself firm in a world of soft voices. That evening Eddard sat with Caitlin again and spoke of Sansa and of Arya, and of what a token is and what a hostage is and of what promises mean when crossed over with blood. Caitlin thought of the time she had held Rob's hand when he was very small and placed it in the water of the hot pool, and he had jerked back and then started again, braver because he knew now the exact temperature of what would happen. "They would call it even," she said, "and if they ever speak of the coldness of stones and you have ever loved them, Ned, they will say, well, you did so too." He looked at the fire then the way men look at their enemies back in a hall, measuring where to put the knife, and then looked away from that thought as if ashamed. "Sansa will not go south," he said at last. "Not after what I saw. There is something in the boy Joffrey that will not give way." Arya would climb the rigging of a Southron ship and run off the instant a gull cried. "Rickon is too small. Bran." He paused, and she put her hand over his because Bran would be a question in their hearts for a long time to come no matter what answer daylight gave. "I will send none," he said then. "It is for us now to be the house that holds. We will be a token of a different kind." Caitlin nodded and thought of the word anchor. Sometimes it is good to keep a ship from going anywhere at all. Snow fell again that night, new as a new cloth laid over an old wound. Tommen dreamed of running with hounds. Myrcella dreamed of walls that leaned inward as if to listen and did not find that frightening. Arya dreamed of a sword thin as a needle and woke cross because in the dream it had been as long as a spear and she had felt very tall. Sansa dreamed of a hall full of light and woke sad because it was dim. Jon dreamed of a long road of ice and of footsteps ahead of him that he had to match or else fall into dark. And he woke steady because he had known the rhythm by heart, even in the dream. And Eddard did not dream or did but did not remember, and woke with the godswood in his bones and a sense of something very old that approvingly had not moved at all. In King's Landing, amongst the woven tapestries of hunts and unicorns and mythic perfidy, Varys bent over a distant wine and warmed his hands by a brazier. In another room Littlefinger rolled dice he did not throw. In another, Renly looked in a mirror and smiled because he could never quite help being pleased by his own reflection. The way a handsome boy will be until the world teaches him that other kinds of gaze have power. In another room, a man with a blank face counted coins not because he needed to but because the act of counting them made him feel that time was not counting him. The city muttered the way a hive does in autumn, when the honey has been drawn off and the bees are still not sure where to turn their work now that the harvest is over. Cersei had new pins made in the shape of lion's claws. She waited for a message that would give her cause to be publicly gracious and privately fierce, or the other way around. She had learned long ago that grief in a queen must put on a dress. She had more of those dresses than anyone in the realm. Jaime brought her a crimson ribbon that had been torn from some common cloth in the market and said it would become her. She smiled. She let it fall to the floor. The maid picked it up. Jaime leaned against the window and looked out at a world his vows required him to distrust. He thought of Winterfell and imagined snow that did not melt on a morning's breath, and thought of his children there warmed by wolves, and felt a sensation that was not entirely like scorn. Days ran fluidly in Winterfell, then, as if poured from a high jug into simple bowls. The cooks learned the measurements of their new mouths. The kennel master learned that Tommen would sneak meat if not watched, and then, once watched, would ask for permission and be proud not to be given it. Mordane learned that Myrcella could repeat a phrase perfectly but could not be made to gossip. The smithy warmed itself early. The gods would took snow and let it go and took it again. Hullen's yearling decided, after 3 days, to keep the bit. Things make their own peace with things in time. On the 7th day, a raven brought news of a boar taken in the Kingswood, a great thing with tusks like trowels, half mad with rut and rage. The men's laughter around the words had the old rough coin in it that men pay toward an hour's joy without any idea of what debt is being incurred. Eddard read it, noted the king's hearty hand, the sober hand beneath it that belonged to a steward, the sharp little sign at the bottom that meant a eunuch had touched the page. He folded it carefully and said nothing at first. He watched Myrcella step over a puddle in the yard. He watched Tommen set his feet in the position Ser Roderick wanted and not move them when a gust pushed at his shoulder. He had done what he could do, he thought, and gods forgive him where what he could do had been too little or too much. Winter had not yet come. It waited, decorous, outside the door. No one knew whose hand would open to it first. For now, under roofs that creaked and in corridors that knew the difference between a child's run and a man's footfall, the house held. The dire wolves crossed the yard with their soft-footed gravity and were not stopped. Myrcella learned the names of the menders and one new song each day. Tommen learned that bruises fade faster when you do not press them to show people. Robb found new weight in a nod. Arya found a way to tie her hair back tight as a boy's, to Mordane's mild despair. Sansa found a stitch that lay flatter than any she had learned before. Jon found that quiet is a companion that does not ask and therefore can be allowed to stay. The ravens woke just before dawn, muttering, their black shoulders hunched against the cold. Luwin fed them and coaxed one onto his arm with a crooning that would have embarrassed him if a man had been in the rookery to hear it. The sky was a pale blue so thin you could put a finger through it and touch the night behind. The first light spread itself across the yard and lit the frost into brief fire. If there were omens, they were the same small omens a house always has. The way a beam takes sunlight and dark in even measure. The way a boy lifts his shield and sets it straight. The way a girl draws a rose on a window and doesn't blow too hard because she has learned you can spoil a beauty by insisting upon it. Eddard walked the walls with his cloak clasped high. He paused at the broken tower and looked down and then up, and then walked on. He could feel, not in his bones because men say that and it is lazy, but in his hands where he had touched the heart tree, that some weight far away had begun to tilt. He did not know which way. He only knew that he had set 2 children in a house where the stones kept faith better than men, and that would have to be enough. He turned his face to the north wind and let it take his breath and give it back. In the yard below, Tommen raised his shield. The wooden sword came down and met it with a clean sound that could have been a beginning. The morning wore its buttons of frost like little coins sewn into a cloak, and all the roofs gave back a dull glow, as if embers lay banked beneath slate and thatch. They had settled into a kind of rhythm that first week, a rhythm that could bear more weight than a day's passing. Little customs that house themselves inside larger ones and live there, snug as mice in a granary. Tommen took porridge with a seriousness beyond his years and ate a second bowl only when Lady Catelyn pretended not to be watching. Myrcella learned which steps on the covered walk carried sound and which did not. Arya taught her where you could lean out of a narrow window and feel the breath of the yard on your face like a speech you weren't supposed to hear. Sansa, who had never been cruel and seldom careless, practiced an art that Septa Mordain would have wished to name charity, but which Caitlin knew, with a better honesty, to be attention. The world is bound together by such things more often than by swords. Eddard was careful with his mornings. He walked the walls. He stood where the wind pressed itself into his hair and his cloak and felt for the old language the stones spoke. The wind in Winterfell is not the wind that hunts a ship or worries at a battlefield. Those are long winds, story winds, bragging winds. This was a household wind. It licked at eaves and chimneys and tugged at banners and sometimes climbed the outside of a tower and sighed into the slit of a window as if asking to be let in. He paused at the broken tower, as he always did, and put a palm to the old stones. They were colder here. The moss had made tiny green maps of continents no man could claim. On the yard below, Ser Roderick's mustaches blew in opposite directions, and the clack of wood on wood took on that steady grain that tells the ear a boy has found the rhythm he was being taught rather than forcing his own. Tommen's shoulders had begun to understand the lesson of a shield, that what you lift is not a weight only but a wall, and that the wall becomes part of your own moving. He still overreached with the sword because boys do. Robb corrected him without hurry, using 2 words when 4 would have muddled. Theon let out a soft whoop when Tommen caught a decent blow, and Ghost turned his white head, brief as a thought, then went on padding toward the meat shed as if he had more important prayers. At midday, Luwin brought Eddard a book, the leather worn to that shine that looks like oil and feels like honesty. A man knows the difference between a new book that has been rubbed with grease to look venerable and an old one that has simply been loved because men kept opening it for reasons other than show. "From the library," Luwin said. "The one John Arryn always asked after when he was here last. I kept it aside in case you—" He stopped, because it is not always good to set a man's old friendships upon the table like bread. Eddard opened the book. The writing was neat enough that you could imagine the scribe had a narrow mouth. Names went down the page like a river of fish, slim and constant, sliding over rocks of titles and dates. Some men love such lists. They feel comforted by the idea that if a thing has been written truly, then the world must obey it. Eddard did not love them, but he recognized the use. "Baratheon," he said. Luwin turned to the place. "The Storm Lords," the maester murmured, and his chain made a mild little sound, a winter insect's clink. It was not the lineages themselves that held Eddard so much as the habit within them. Here was a marriage, here a begetting, here a boy or a girl. Here the note of hair and eye that some careful scribe had made because his habit was to regard the small as the pathway to the large. Black hair recurred like a drumbeat. Even when a Lannister cousin appeared, a marriage meant to fatten coffers and tie ribbons between rocks, the black returned. It does not prove anything, Eddard told himself, and knew that men sometimes take a thing that does not prove and make a bridge of it to a thing they want to be true. John Arryn's last words returned to him in the way a remembered smell returns. Not as a line with edges, but as a room you find yourself standing in before you've thought to open its door. The seed is strong. It had seemed a line about barley the first time he heard it. Now it bent itself toward people. He closed the book gently, not as if it were precious only, but as if it were sleeping and you wished to leave it so. "Keep it by," he said, and Luwin bowed his gray head and took it as if it were a living thing that might nip if handled roughly. He did not speak to Caitlin of it that hour. He watched instead the lives of the house as if the house, too, might teach him what lineages only hinted at. Myrcella had learned the names of a dozen women by then and used them with care. It matters where you put a name in a sentence, before, after, in the middle, like a cup set between 2 hands. She put them well. Tommen learned which men would praise him cheaply to curry favor with someone else, and which would praise like a payment given with a clear tally of what was owed. He learned to prefer the latter and not to punish the former, which is a better lesson than men like to think. On the 8th day, a raven came in the late morning with its feathers blown into disarray by an inland wind. Its claw had scraped itself bloody against the leather ties, the way some men will rub at a ring until the skin beneath grows raw, as if the rubbing itself could undo the vow. It brought a brief line from the south in Robert's large hand. "All lunge and splay. Great boar in the Kingswood. We hunt like wolves. Ale like horse piss. Your wolves better." He had pressed his signet deeply, as if trying to fix the moment in wax so that it could not run away. Eddard read it twice and smiled once, because you cannot love a man and take no pleasure in his pleasures, however coarse. Then let the smile go. Caitlin read over his shoulder. When he set the parchment down, her fingers rested on it a time, as women's fingers rest on a table after the bowls have been cleared and the men have gone out to speak of matters. Part presence, part the steadying of something that wants to slide. He laughs a great deal when he hunts, Eddard said. He laughs a great deal when he is afraid of being made to sit still, Caitlin said. They stood together at the window. The yard wore its sounds differently with new children in it. Little changes in tone creep into the life of a place when strangers become less strange. Laughter approaches a new pitch, the quiet is taken as another sort of quiet, not enforced but chosen. They watched Tommen hold the practice sword too tight at the grip and slowly learn to loosen. They watched Myrcella take a stitch up and tuck it under so flat that Mordain did not purse her lips. Mordain seldom had a smile, but an absence of pursed lips can be as eloquent as a grin. The world has many small ways of saying well done. That night after the house thinned into sleep and then into that deeper sleep that cloth and timber learn even better than men, Eddard and Luwin sat by the banked fire and spoke of seed and hair and the slow stubbornness of families. A man who knows the breeding of hounds can go half his life without considering that the breeding of men has any rules, Luwin said mildly. But if you sit long enough, your mind starts to put things beside other things. Jon Arryn sat long enough, Eddard said. The words were not accusation and not praise either. They were a stone laid where it belonged. He had this book by him. He asked also for rolls from Old Town, Luwin said, for a copy of Septon Barth's treatise on humors and begettings, though that is rarer than hen's teeth. For a letter some maester in a long ago spring wrote about the color of a child's hair, when a mother read as autumn married a father black as a raven's wing. He had curiosity, Lord Eddard, and that is a virtue with a vice sleeping inside it. There are sorts of curiosity that keep men alive and sorts that put their heads on spikes. He said the seed is strong, Eddard murmured. I thought he spoke of barley. Barley's seed is strong, Luwin said. Strong enough to make men forget their sins for an evening. Eddard looked into the coals. A log cracked and shed a small, bright shower like smith fire. I will write to Stannis, he said then, not as if beginning a war, but as if setting a nail square and quiet. Not with accusations, with questions that do not need to name themselves. He is Robert's lawful heir if Robert. He did not finish. That is the thing about kings and boors. Men speak around it until the thing itself kicks through the talk. Luwin dipped his head. Dragonstone is a long way, he said. Long roads do good work. They give men time to temper their first words. Eddard wrote that night, the way a man in winter sometime pours water along the sill of a new window to see where the leaks run. He wrote to Stannis Baratheon in plain terms, respectful, like stepping onto a stranger's ship with clean feet. Speaking of the status of the wards, of Robert's sport, of Jon Arryn's curiosity and the ways a realm may be soured by whispers if a man doesn't write to another man in time. He wrote to Lord Hoster at Riverrun, softer and with more family in it, and to the Eyrie with a letter that did not accuse but remembered. He wrote to White Harbor, because the Manderleys count the wind like merchants count coin. He did not write to Cersei. He did not yet know which words to give her that would not themselves become the weapons he feared she already held. Caitlin came behind his chair, put her hand upon the back of it, and stood that way a long while. When did you begin to notice their hair? She asked at last. When I first looked at them and then again yesterday, he said. He did not turn. And between those two looks, years may have passed in my mind. That happens to us in grief, she said. Minds go into a wood and come out at a different tree. He set the quill down. If I am wrong, if you are wrong, we will have kept 2 children safe in a cold, honorable house while men shouted, she said. There are worse wrongs. Tommen slept with his mouth a little open that night, and the warm air went in and out without fuss like a cat slipping under a door. Myrcella curled on her side and tucked a hand under her cheek the way Cersei must have done as a girl, if anyone in that house had been watching for such small loveliness. Arya snored once, surprised by it, and woke long enough to be cross at the unfairness. Sansa dreamed of a hall full of lanterns that floated without smoke. Jon walked the east wall with Ghost. The stars were thin, a poor man's stew of light, but steady. On the 10th day, a raven came with a piece of the south's breath still in its feathers. Rich, a little rotten like river mud. The seal had been pressed smartly and in haste both. Robert's hand had made a scrawl that tried to be steady and could not. Gourd, it said, and then last cup was good. Varys's hand enclosed it like a prudent wall, words careful as men in a house that is falling in. The king took a hurt, maesters tend him. He calls for you at times and then forgets. He claims to have written you, but I send this besides out of caution. The king had had a second hand in it, too, someone with flour on his fingers and integrity in his back. A steward's neatness trying not to show itself. Eddard read the words like a man tasting something he had once loved and now did not trust. There is a way men stand when they hear that someone they have built a life around has been taken down to the place beyond physicians and prayers. Their shoulders do not drop. That would be too much a wearing of grief on the outside. They set their feet a little wider, as if bracing for wind, and their faces become plain. Catelyn watched Eddard stand that way and felt, as a good wife does in such moments, both near and far to him at once. Near enough to put a hand upon that plainness, and far in the sense that his thought had gone among old trees she could not climb. He went to the gods' wood. He told the leaves nothing because there was nothing that would not sound like begging or bargaining, and the old gods disapprove of bargains more than men do. He breathed and counted and let the cold climb into his breath and back out. He sat a while with his back to the heart tree, as if leaning on an old man who would say nothing cruel and nothing kind and therefore be bearable. The household took the news like a cup passed hand to hand. Some sipped, some gulped, some flexed the fingers of memory around it and set it down without tasting because they were afraid of what the taste might turn them into. Tommen stood straighter. Myrcella wrote a letter so carefully that Luwin had to tell her twice to breathe. She forgot and then remembered and then forgot again. Sansa cut her finger on a needle and did not cry, and then cried later when she was alone because crying in solitude is a way to keep the world from feeling humiliated by your grief. Arya went to the yard and attacked a straw dummy in such a serious fury that even Theon lowered his chuckle in respect. Robb inspected the grain bins and found 2 barrels that had been damp at the bottom and ordered them vented and replaced, and did it without looking to find Eddard's approval with his eyes. A house will always try to turn what it hears into a chore, because chores are the prayers it understands. 2 days later, while the frost shone like glass shattered and swept to the edges of the yard, another raven came. It used up its life on the flight. You could see it in the way it clung to the perch as if the air beyond were a debt collector. Its note had 2 hands. Varys again, neat and measured, and beneath it a sharper, impatient script that wore the page like a spur. Renly. The king is dead, the latter said, without dressing. Renly had written his grief with speed and let it be seen. Varys followed with words about succession and safety and the need for calm, which is always the way clever men speak when the thing they want is not calm but advantage. The name Joffrey did not appear on the page, and that told Eddard more than if it had. There was a line about Cersei's composure that could be read 2 ways, and a line about the council that could be read a dozen. Eddard closed his eyes and saw Robert as he had been when they were boys, the way certain mornings had broken over the veil so cleanly that even Robert's boisterousness had quieted to make room for it. He saw him in tourneys and in a bed in a tent the night before a battle, quieter than he'd ever been, speaking of a dream of a child who had not yet been born. The living fall into the past at a terrible speed. He rubbed 2 fingers against the page as if he could hold a part of the man there by friction. "What will we do?" Catelyn asked that evening when the house's breath had grown even with sleep. "What we must," he said, and smiled with one corner of his mouth because that line, too, is a kind of sword men draw when they cannot afford to show how blunt they feel. "We will not send the children south. They will be guests and well-treated hostages, and we will say so plainly. We will write to Stannis naming him rightful heir and swearing our swords to him if he comes north, or to a place between, under the band of law. We will invite Lords Manderley and Umber and Serwyn to Winterfell to take measure of the matter and add the weight of the North to the scale of order instead of the scale of fire. And I will write to Tywin Lannister in full courtesy and tell him that his grandchildren will be honored in Winterfell until the realm has sat and chosen what it will. The letter will sound like obedience written by a man who remembers law. He will hate it because he will find no honorable crack in it to pry at. He will send a crack of his own, Catelyn said. He will make one. Yes, Eddard said simply. So we must be wood that splits the way we choose. The letters went. There is a moment when wax is a liquid that will take any seal, and then it becomes fixed, and men, too, have such moments. Eddard tried to catch the world in that liquid instant and press what was best into it. It is the great vanity of steadied men. What came back first was not from Casterly Rock or Dragonstone, but from the Eyrie. Lisa's hand, fluttering and calm like a woman teaching a child to sew with small careful lies. She spoke of her fears for her son, and the winds that had lately grown cold in the vale even though the leaves had not yet all fallen. She spoke of spiders, which she meant and did not mean Varys by. Lisa had a way of weaving webs of her own and then pretending to be caught in them by accident. She did not name a side. She named her son. Sometimes the naming of a child is the fiercest kind of neutrality. From White Harbor, Lord Wyman wrote more stoutly, careful and fat with caution, like a man who knows how a ship rides a sudden squall. He would come with a modest train if Winterfell desired it, and he sent a cask of spiced wine and a wheel of cheese so rich it made men generous for the space of a meal. Generosity in a lord will get you more than 10 banners in a winter indeed. The great John sent no letter. He sent himself, which is a letter written in meat and mead and speaks plainly. He came roaring in as if he were the wind-made man, threw off his cloak like a storm shedding spray, and stamped the yard clean of any pretense that day would be a quiet one. He bowed to Lady Catelyn with the gravity he kept in a pocket for such moments, then crushed Eddard's forearms in his hands and called him brother before tasting the ale. When Tommen came to the rail to see, the great John saw him, too, and his eyebrows went up like drawbridges. "So the lion's cubs have come to winter among wolves," he said with a grin. "It will do them good. Lions are lazy in summer. Wolves are only themselves when the cold puts tooth to bone." Tommen gulped and then nearly smiled, because a compliment in a growl is better than a kindness in a sneer. Myrcella curtsied, and the great John bowed back with surprisingly good grace for a man of his bulk. "Your grandam made a good match to a clever bastard," he said, and then stopped himself with a glance at Lady Catelyn, "because some histories are like wine not to be poured in front of children. You'll find no lack of warmth here," he finished, which was true and an untruth both. "The North's warmth is of a particular kind, and you must learn its wick." At supper that night, the hall carried its voices as netting carries silver fish, heavy, delicate, with sudden slippings and silver turnings. The great John told a story about a winter that had lasted long enough to teach men to scrape mice and be grateful, and made a show of eating with relish, to teach a prince that stories about privation can be told without begging pity. Tommen watched him the way a puppy watches an older dog, with solemn hope of learning. Myrcella asked Lady Catelyn about the coats in the picture hall that showed the Stark lords with their wolves painted thin and terrible. Sansa sang a bit after the trenchers were taken away. Arya had found a worm in a log that afternoon and wanted to show it to someone, but Mordain said perhaps the morning would be better. Myrcella taught Sansa a Southron hand game that made little claps and the sound of knuckles, and Arya learned it quicker than Sansa and then pretended not to have learned it quicker because she has a better heart than she knows. Eddard watched all of it and at the same time thought of Dragonstone, hard and salt and lonely, and of Stannis upon it, counting candles instead of friends, and of Casterly Rock, that gold-sided mountain that has taught generations to think of wealth as a fortress that can be inherited. He thought of the trident and of a tower near the end of the world. A man's mind will pull its own map when he thinks too long. He let it, then folded it away because the duty at hand is always a handspan before you. Stannis's letter came 11 days later, written in a hand that would have been a sneer if it had had a face. It was proper and cold, and everything a righteous man believes will save him from being murdered by a cunning one. He acknowledged the courtesy of Eddard's information. He said, with a legal neatness that suggested he had breathed dust in a maester's room longer than was good for lungs, that the line of succession made no mention of a queen's preference. He did not speak of hair. He asked where and when the North would bear witness to a lawful claim if law were to be the steersman of the realm. He did not ask after the children. Stannis has so little patience for gardens. He will walk through a pleasant one without stepping on a flower but will not bend to smell it. Eddard read the letter twice. He cannot be charmed, Catelyn said. That is a comfort. A comfort and a trouble, Eddard said. Charm is a sort of false bridge across a ravine. Better crossing than falling. But sometimes a false bridge is the only way to get a frightened child across. He put the letter beside the Book of Lineages and went to the Godswood and did not pray. From Casterly Rock, a letter came at last without apology and without haste. Tywin Lannister does not give the dignity of hurry to any man but himself. The language was flawless swordwork, and the blade was held inside the scabbard. He acknowledged the king's death with a generosity that showed he had not loved the king and would pretend to have for as long as it bought him praise. He demanded nothing. He named the children by their names and asked, in sentences that were not questions but declarations wearing a mask, that they be sent south to attend their mother in her grief and the new king in his hour. He called Joffrey king without a cough between word and word. He wrote that a realm is best served when custom is honored, then made no mention of which custom he meant. He sent a gift, a fine clasp for a lady's cloak, 2 lions facing one another with a white gem between their paws, and a small dart inside the tissue of politeness. Winter is coming, he wrote, so is a Lannister host if necessity bids. One comes by season and the other by will. It is generally wise to acquaint oneself with both. Eddard set the clasp aside without rancor. Catelyn turned it in her fingers and felt, as any woman would, the pull a pretty thing has even when it is made by hands you distrust. She had the sense to be irritated by her own pleasure in it, and that is a sort of honesty not all women possess. We will answer, Eddard said, and did. A letter wound so tight with courtesy that it could not be unrolled without breaking. Rooted in guest right and the laws of wardship and the needs of winter, which all men in the North are taught to speak aloud as if the words themselves had heat to give. Between the letters came a quiet life in which the important things were not quiet at all. Tommen learned to sit a shaggy pony that would one day be good only for pulling a cart, and learned more from that obstinate little horse than he would have learned from a noble palfrey. He fell twice and did not cry, then once when no one was looking and did. Afterwards he found the honesty in telling Robb that he had, and Robb found the honesty in saying, so did I, once. Myrcella and Sansa took to walking with Lady Catelyn to the Godswood and back, speaking little in the trees and more outside them, as if the leaves had taught them to keep certain sounds in themselves. Arya found a way to slip beneath the stable rail without tearing her gown and later that week tore it anyway climbing a stack of barrels. When Mordain scolded her, Myrcella laughed a little and then said, polite as a white rose, that perhaps the gown had been too narrow at the hip seemed to bear a girl's proper stride. Mordain blinked. That laugh had not been cruel. Myrcella was very good at not being cruel. It is a better accomplishment than men credit. Jon allowed himself, one evening, to show Tommen how to fletch a practice arrow. The boy watched with such grateful attention that Jon felt the old ache of his own boyhood shame. How it is to be eager for instruction when the thing you most want instruction in is how to be a son like other sons. Feathers from the same wing, Jon said, setting them, careful as a prayer. Else it wobbles. Tommen nodded as if Jon had told him something magic. Ghost lay down and watched the bow as if it were a thing that might run if not gazed upon properly. When the first thin skin of the moat froze, a sound came from it that is always like a distant drum. Men hear it and think an enemy marches. Women hear it and think of their children's heartbeats in their arms when they were infants. Tommen heard it and asked Luwin, who told him how ice talks to itself when the night grows and the water beneath remembers movement and resents stillness. Myrcella heard it and said it sounded like someone knocking inside the world and asking to be let in. In King's Landing, men knocked and were let in. Renly left with a quiet quickness that is a kind of bravery coward's mistake for cowardice. He left before a door could close and call it flight. Varys told a story about mice and cheese to a man who laughed at the wrong place and later died. Cersei wore her hair in a new fashion and stood at a window so that men in the yard below would look up and say the word queen to themselves like a charm. Joffrey sat in a chair that had bruised greater men and believed his immunity to bruising a sign of destiny rather than a measure of how protected he was by the adults the chair had taught to be cautious. The small council wrote letters and destroyed them and wrote them again. Littlefinger traced a finger along a map with the intimacy men reserve for lovers or coffers. It is amazing how many men will mistake the world for a ledger and themselves for the pen. What reached Winterfell of all that came as aftertaste? Letters, rumors, a tinker's tale, bright as a trout and no more reliable. There was talk of Stannis naming himself not merely heir but king upon Dragonstone. There was talk of Renly smiling with too many retainers in his wake. There was talk of Tywin's host moving in the west with a slowness that meant he was gathering, not hesitating. Word came that the Riverlands had seen spears glittering and a farmstead burned as if by accident. Accidents, in such seasons, come in battalions. No word came of Stannis' fleet, and that silence said as much as shouting would have. Eddard called his captains to the solar. They stood with their caps in their hands, then put them on because Eddard told them to. A man is warmer when told to be. Roose Bolton's face looked like milk left in a cold cellar. He listened so well that men always felt they had been too loud. The Grachan's voice filled the room and then sat down cross-legged upon the floor like a big dog that means to be good. Tallheart and Glover and Serwyn asked questions that were really statements dressed as courtesy. Eddard laid his hand flat upon the old map again. "We will not march first," he said, "and let the breath go out of the room and then return. Not unless the Riverlands ask our swords. We will strengthen Moat Cailin. We will write to every holdfast in words that cannot be misunderstood. We will take no man's bread who isn't paid for it, and no man's son for spears who hasn't sworn to our banners already. We will be ready. Readiness is an army of its own. Tywin will march in the west," the great Jon rumbled. "He will think himself a stag hunter and the realm the forest, and he will imagine all horns belonging to him. He will not come north first," Eddard said. "He will hope to take 3 bites of the Riverlands and then turn to the Trident to drink. If we march now, he will say the wolf broke guest right and the lion only defended the feast. We will give him no such banner to wave. Guest right won't soften his horn," someone growled in the low way men talk when they do not want their wives to hear their simple anger. "Law is a lace the South cuts when it pinches. Which is why we will not," Eddard said, and there was a steel in it that men leaned toward like they leaned toward a fire. "Hold our temper as we hold our knives. When the right meal arrives, we will cut it clean." After, in the corridor, Theon fell in beside Robb with that easy shoulder knock that boys use when they want to be men and need to remind themselves of a boy's license. "Hold, hold, hold," he mimicked softly. "We will hold until the lions come to the door and then say, 'Good day, sirs. Have you a letter from your father to prove your courtesy?'" Robb's mouth tightened and then let go. "You think my father fears them," he said. "I think your father fears the wrong thing," Theon said lightly, and when Robb looked, he grinned. "He fears being dishonorable more than being dead. I suppose that is why men love him. Men love him because he keeps them alive," Robb said, and then, almost as if he were trying a thing on for weight, "and because they trust how he hates to break his word. I would like to be that sort of man." "You will be a man the day you discover your word is a whip and a chain both," Theon said, and clapped him again and went off to tell a joke to a girl who would half like him for it and half dislike herself. Myrcella spoke little that day. In the afternoon, when the light had narrowed to a band you could set your hand inside and feel sharper than the rest of the air, Catelyn found her in the picture hall looking up at a stark lady whose painted eyes were winter blue. "Who was she?" Myrcella asked, hushed but not with fear. Rather with that particular reverence children sometimes feel in places where the dead are permitted to see the living. "My husband's grandmother," Catelyn said. "She rode a shaggy horse and wore a cap of fox fur that made her laugh when the wind tried to take it. She raised 5 sons and a daughter and lived to see the first of their children born. She could sit a chair as still as ice, and she could dance. She looks like she would not have minded me," Myrcella said, honest as a glove turned right side out. "She would have minded your mother?" Caitlin said before she could stop herself. In that dry way a woman sometimes speaks when truth has slipped its leash. "Then she would have been polite." Myrcella's mouth pressed itself into a small, valiant line, and then she laughed, once softly. "I would rather be minded than pitied," she said, and then bent her head as if ashamed of the size of what she had said. "I am sorry. That is not a kind thing to say." "It is kind to be true when truth is not a dagger," Caitlin said. "There are enough daggers for anyone who wants one." That evening another raven came, and the air in the rookery had that smell of late daylight. A little old hay, a little iron, the faintness of feathers worked too long. The seal was Joffrey's. The words were not his, for a boy does not write like a lawyer overnight, but they wore his signature the way a mask wears a face. He named himself king. He commanded the return of his brother and sister to King's Landing by the hand of Lord Eddard Stark, whom he named also Hand in a flourish of boyish magnanimity that would have been amusing if it were not terrible. He bade the North send arms and men and its love. He called Tywin Warden of the West as if the West had needed the naming. He wrote of traitors and did not name Stannis but made a shape a man could set that name inside. He finished with a line that must have come from Cersei's tongue and a Septon's quill. "The love between great houses is the girdle of the realm." Eddard read it with his head tilted, as if the words were a painting hung a finger's breadth off true. "Well," he said at last, "a girdle." Caitlin took the parchment from him and set it down as if it might leak. "We will answer," she said. "We will," he said, "with courtesy that will make them wince." He wrote. He wrote as one writes when one knows that the letter will be read later as a piece of evidence and earlier as an insult and in the present as a puzzle. He acknowledged the boy's grief, which must be his mother's grief. He spoke of the children's safety and of the old laws. He spoke of Robert, a king named without the epithet beloved, because men in the north keep such epithets for their own dead, not the realm's. He said he would come south when the rivers had lost their ice and the roads could bear a train fit to carry children safely, and his own train proper to a Lord Paramount of the North. He spoke the name Stannis not at all. He folded the letter. He let the wax cool just so before he pressed the direwolf into it. He gave it to Luwin and said nothing until Luwin's footsteps had died away, and then said softly, "He was a boy once too." Caitlin did not ask which he meant. In such seasons there are too many boys once. On the 11th night after Robert's death, Arya found Myrcella awake and sitting with her knees drawn up under her chin, the pale blanket bundled around her like a cloak. Arya was not good at keeping still when she noticed such things, so she said, "Do you want to sneak?" And Myrcella's face lit in a way that had nothing to do with lamp or fire. They went soft along the corridor and down the steps and out into the yard where the cold had thinned to a bearable edge. Ghost watched them cross as if he were a priest at a border. They went to the glass with their breaths and made pictures. They went to the well and Arya let the rope down and hand over hand raised the bucket and showed Myrcella how to do it without skinning her palms. They went to the Godswood Gate and stopped there because even Arya had learned not to run in the gods' hearing. "Do you believe in them?" Myrcella asked, not as a challenge but as a girl trying to take correct steps on a polished floor. "I believe in everything in there," Arya said. "I believe the tree would hurt a man who heard it. I believe it can hear. I believe the leaves say things. I don't know what they say, but I believe they say them." Myrcella nodded as if Arya had put a thing into her hand that she had been trying to catch herself. "The seven are very beautiful," she said, freeing the words with care. "I like the mother, but when I pray, I think I am asking someone who is very busy to please notice me. Here, when I stand by the tree, I think I am standing with someone who already knows I'm there." Arya considered this. "If you tell Mordain you said that, she will put you in a story to frighten children," she said judiciously. "I won't tell," Myrcella said, and for the first time since she had come north her voice held the tiny ring of disobedience that marks belonging. When they came back, Sansa was awake, too, and frowned at them and then could not help but smile because the room had that smell of cold air and girls' warm hair that always made her think of winters when she had been smaller and thought every night would bring some present if she were only good. "You shouldn't," she said, and tucked Myrcella's hair behind her ear like a sister. If Mordain finds out. She won't, Arya said with the confidence of a child who has forgotten that women older than her remember what it was to be her and therefore know where to look. We were very quiet. You are only quiet when you're thinking of mischief, Sansa said, but her tone was warm. She went to the window and looked out at the graying yard and then at the little sliver of sky. I wish, she began, and stopped because wishes in such times sound greedy even to the wisher. What? Myrcella asked, curious but careful. I wish someone would teach me something I do not already know, Sansa said. Mordain teaches me very well. My mother teaches me very well. I want to learn something the world didn't know I could learn. Myrcella smiled in that swift way she had. I can show you the hand game with the very hard claps, she said, and Sansa laughed. And in the morning Mordain found 3 girls whose eyes looked older and kinder and decided, cleverly, to say nothing. The first snow thick enough to call a fall came thinly, but it lined the branches of the heart tree and softened the yard into a place where footfalls wrote and erased themselves. Men walked as men do when winter begins to speak with the proper voice, more carefully and with a respect that is older than law. Letters came and went. From the wall came a small square of stiff vellum in Benjen Stark's frank hand. A news of watch and wind and the vanishing of rangers that would have made a poet if there were a poet who wanted to write of men forgotten for good reason. Jon read it with that tightening he felt in his ribs when he thought of the long road. I will go soon, he said to Ghost without ceremony, and Ghost thumped his tail once, which might have meant anything a boy wanted. Eddard and Catelyn sat together over the map again. He will go, Catelyn said. It will be good and ill, like most honest things. He will go, Eddard agreed. Before we are called to go, perhaps. It is a comfort to know someone we love will be where vows still mean one thing at a time. Do you think that of the wall? She asked, not mocking. That vows there are single stones in a straight wall? I think even there, men stack them crooked and call the wall straight because they wish it. I think the wall at least has the honesty of being seen, he said. There are not many places left where men can look at a thing and know it is what it claims. She placed her hand on the map where the trident forked and then flowed. War will go there first, she said. War is like a man who always goes to his favorite chair and then wonders why he has ruined it by sitting. It will go, he said. We will try to teach it manners at our border. Another letter from Dragonstone came in a different hand. Maester's ink, not Stannis' tight script. It declared that, by the laws of gods and men, Stannis Baratheon was the rightful king. It named Joffrey Pretender without calling him bastard. It asked the North to declare. It was a letter that sounded like a drumbeat. The North does not love drums, but it knows marching. Eddard kept it on the table for a day, as if keeping a candle lit to see who might come to warm his hands by it. The Great Jon warmed his loudly. Roose Bolton warmed with no visible motion, but a thin smile touched the edge of his mouth that might have been a knife lifted in a glove. Tallheart and Glover and Serwyn took its heat and turned it over like blacksmiths judging a horseshoe. Catelyn felt the letter's warmth and thought of her father, and of the river that would be crossed whether she wished it or no. She went to the rookery that evening with a letter of her own. Daughter's hand to father's, speaking of the winter and of the children and nothing of war, because there is a kindness in letting an old lord have one more night of untroubled bread. Luwin took it gently, his fingers smelling of grain and feathers. The ravens have flown hard, he said quietly. We will need to rest them in turn. Men forget birds are soldiers too. I won't, she said, and set her hand to the smooth beak of a gray bird that turned its black bright eye and measured her. I won't forget anything that carries a word from one heart to another. The river of days went on with a new current beneath. Tommen stood in the yard in a small snowstorm and raised his shield to catch the flakes, laughing because a shield is not only for blows. Sometimes it is a toy. Myrcella learned to lace her boots with numb fingers. Sansa learned to warm hers under a stone heated at the hearth, and showed it to Myrcella, proud of the service. Arya learned that when you throw a snowball in a stiff wind, it arcs back toward you as if the world had decided mischief should teach its own lessons. John learned the taste of a decision on his tongue like a penny behind a tooth. He would hold it there and then spit it into his palm and show it to his father, and his father would nod and say, "Yes, son, that seems like coin," and they would spend it. And then, as men who live near rivers will tell you happens even when the surface seems quiet, a thing under the water struck hard enough to knock a man from his feet. A rider came in from the south with a horse blown and a face chapped to leather and a letter in his glove that had not been sealed because it had been read and kept warm by too much handling. "The Riverlands," he said before he even drank, "the Riverlands burn." Sir Amory Lorch with a band of freeriders took a village and then the next, saying they were hunting wolves. The wolves had been sheep and the sheep were now nothing. Lord Edmure called the banners. Lord Hoster was taken to his bed by the anger of it. Men saw a golden lion's tail on the wind and another and another. It was not yet war, the rider said, but it had the smell of war, and the smell is the thing that moves before a man knows he has made a choice. Eddard took the rider's hands between his own. "Eat," he said. "Then we will read your words again together in the light." He turned to Caitlin after, and his face had that plainness again that means a man has set two fears upon a scale and seen them balance and must now find a third weight to tip it. "I will go south," he said quietly. "Not all the way to King's Landing. South enough to meet Lord Manderley on the road, to speak with the Lords of the Trident as they pass. We will draw a circle men can step into who want peace that is not surrender. You will keep the children. The lion will not dare. If he dares, he will break more than law. He will break the thing that lets men say their prayers." Caitlin felt the fear come and then order itself the way older fears school younger ones. "I will hold them," she said. "I will keep them safe enough to make a song." He touched her cheek and did not say the litany that came with such touches because litany drains strength if said too often. He went to the yard. He watched Tommen change his feet and set the shield and ride out the blow. He watched Myrcella stand very still when Arya's snowball went astray and struck her and then laugh with a surprise that was relief. He stood under the balcony and looked up. "I will return before the first thaw," he said into the cold air. The cold air took the words and kept them. Men who live long in the north learn to let the air keep certain promises on their behalf. That night, before he slept, he stood at the heart tree again. The face in the bark was very old with its own kind of youth that belongs to things that will not die everywhere at once. "I put a lion's cubs beneath your branches," he said, "which is not prayer and not boast. Keep them as you have kept my father's bones and my grandfather's name." The wind did not answer, but it leaned around him like a great beast might lean against a man it did not mind and then moved away without harm. He slept and dreamt of a river with two banks and a bridge between that had not yet been finished and men carrying planks in the snow and singing without joy and without despair. A work song that had no hurry in it and that would be sung until it did not need to be sung any longer. In the morning, before the porridge was ladled and the first pails emptied from the well, John came to him and said, "Father, I would go north before you go south." Eddard looked at the boy a long time and then at Ghost, who stood with his mouth shut and his eyes bright as if he knew his name and would not speak it because it belonged to someone else. "Go," Eddard said. "Go now, with Benjen's letter in your belt and my hand upon your back. You will take the king's children to the gate and tell them that a man who knows himself keeps his vow in winter first. If they ask why I let you go, say it is because I believe in walls that stand when stones are true." John bowed, and his eyes shone and then steadied. He went, and Ghost flowed beside him, a piece of Snow's own idea. Tommen came to the yard to see him off and Myrcella, and the Stark girls who were wolves of very different temperaments. Tommen hugged him quickly the way boys do who are embarrassed to be men and men to be boys. Myrcella took his hand and then let it go with a little squeeze that promised she would remember this decency and hold it in her pocket against the day when all other coins proved counterfeit. "I am glad you showed me how to fletch," Tommen said, as if that were the largest thing a man can do for another. "I will make the arrows straight." "Feathers from the same wing," John said and managed to smile. "Feathers from the same wing," Tommen repeated gravely, and Arya, hearing, nodded because it sounded like sense you could put on bread. The gates opened to let John and Benjen's men pass. The day was the color of iron. The wall would be a bar of brightness in that, terrible and honest. Eddard watched until the small figures were no longer small but gone. A piece of what he had loved taken to a place he had taught his heart to respect. He turned back into the house where lions slept and wolves watched, and the old laws drew breath in the mouths of men and women who had learned their taste was simple and sustaining. He set himself to the road south, not all the way, but enough. He kissed Caitlyn's hair in the stair and set his forehead against hers for a heartbeat. He put his hand on Rob's shoulder and felt the bone of the boy and the beginning of the weight of the man. He touched Sansa's cheek and let her straighten his collar as she liked, because it makes girls feel useful to a world that will ask them later to be useful in worse ways. He crouched to Rickon and called him lordling and made the child proud. He had a moment with Theon that looked like laughter and was actually instruction dressed as jest. He put his palm to the heart tree and did not ask anything. Then he swung into the saddle to move along the spine of a realm that had taken a hurt and would now make of hurt an excuse and of excuse a flag. The party went out under a sky where the gray had that particular clarity to it that means snow later, not now. Behind him, in the yard, Tommen raised his shield to meet a blow and met it square, and the sound it made rang clean as a coin struck on a winter morning. Ahead of him, the road tightened and then spread and then tightened again as roads do that were made by men who had taken their plows far and asked the land to allow a passage. Caitlyn stood at the gate until the last banner was swallowed by the bend. She had learned what it is to hold a place. It is the art of tending coals and knowing when to stir and when to leave them. She turned back into the house, where Myrcella stood with her hands folded in that careful way she had, and Tommen shook snow from his hair and told Arya solemnly that he had learned how to catch it on his tongue without getting a numb lip. Sansa asked if they might go to the Godswood and leave a ribbon on a low branch as beautiful women do in Southron stories. "We do not do that here," Caitlyn said, and then, because a good house learns new courtesies without losing the old, added, "But we can go and stand, and the leaves will know what we have brought." They went. The heart tree's face looked down at them without blessing and without malice. Myrcella made the sign the septa had taught her, and then let her hand fall and stood as the wolves do when they scent but are not sure. Tommen's breath smoked. His cheeks glowed. His hair under the little cap had a ruff of gold. Arya stamped once and then remembered and stood. Sansa smoothed her glove and thought of a ribbon she could not tie and found that she did not mind. The old gods received them as they receive snow and ravens and men with the truth stuck in their throats. The house breathed and went on. South, near the Trident, the air smelled of horses and haste. A banner with a lion on it moved as if it had taught wind its manners. Men set fire to stubble to keep the cold off their hands. A child cried over a broken pail. A lord spoke into his beard and made a war with his lips that would soon enough teach his hands. Eddard Stark rode toward that noise with the quiet of a man who has been noisy when it mattered and now will be quiet because men like him both ways. He carried with him a weight of law and 2 children's safety and a letter that said mercy in a voice that could not be accused of plaintiveness. He carried a memory of a boar and a boy who had loved to laugh. He carried Winterfell in the set of his shoulders and the old gods in the way he did not pray aloud. Behind him, Winterfell held, lions under its roof and wolves pacing, and the snow that fell after dark wrote soft lines across the yard that morning boots would erase. In King's Landing, the lights burned late behind curtains where men counted and smiled. On Dragonstone, the sea said the same thing it had said for 1,000 years to a man who did not much care for its old songs. Between, the Riverlands lifted their heads to see which way the smoke bent, and found that the smoke belonged to strangers and soon enough to themselves. The realm had taken a wound and would discover, as realms do, whether it wished to heal or learn to glory in the scar. In the middle of it, in a northern hall whose timbers had been rubbed by so many winters that the wood had learned to be kind, 2 golden-haired children went to their pallets with their cheeks pink and their minds tired from new customs. Myrcella tucked her hand beneath her cheek again and thought, as she had thought more nights than not since coming north, that the air in Winterfell seemed always to be listening. Tommen dreamed of a pony that did not like bits and woke with the solution of patience already warming in his hands. Sansa lay awake a while and thought of a song that was not old and not new. Arya slept with one hand curled as if it gripped a sword that was not there and never far. The dire wolves turned in their sleep and settled. Outside, The snow began to fall with more seriousness, and the gatehouse lanterns burned with that stoic friend's light that says, "Here we are. Come in if you are of this house, pass by if you are not. Either way, we will still be burning when you have gone."